Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
I don't know how many of you in the audience are polyamorous and how many of you believe in the idea of one true love. But Arundhati's observations about love and relationships are universal, and they're relevant to all of us. Her experience with love that crosses boundaries is of utmost importance at a time when lovers are under attack, simply because they opt for the right to choose a person or who they can love. Loving someone has always been a political act, and in the India of today, when lovers are routinely discriminated against, and when there's a massive patriarchal backlash against those who don't toe the mainstream line, this holds more true than ever before. So many of us who love are waiting for the country to accept a simple universal truth that unconventional love is not unnatural. Arundhati says in her book, to maintain relationships, one needs to listen patiently and hold hearts with gentleness. She says it's possible to love a person like one loves the inflection in a poem or the edge of an ocean without having to own that poem or ocean. One can also rejoice when others enjoy them. I thought that was really beautiful. Every one of us in a relationship, whether it's monoamorous or polyamorous, needs to imbibe at least some of her love lessons. Whether it's Arundhati's need for balancing solitude with partnership or her struggles with jealousy, we could all do with a dose of her insights and understanding about the nature of human relationships. She says, as a practitioner of many desires, I have fallen, been broken. Who better to learn from than someone who can share openly and wisely about things she's picked up along her deeply thought-out journey of polyamory. Arundhati, you define polyamory as a practice of being in love with or without sexual intimacies with more than one person simultaneously with the consent of all. You also define it in your classic style as loving to your heart's content. What are the challenges to practicing polyamory in the Indian context? Or maybe I should say, what are the challenges to loving to your heart's content in a country that hates lovers? Tell us why you wrote this book also,
Yeah, in a country that hates lovers and rejoices, the Khajuraho rejoices Kama Sutra as well.
That was so long ago.
Yeah. You mean the rejoicing part? It's still there. Yeah. Yeah. Specifically, so the question that you asked, both the questions are slightly related because one of the reasons why I wrote the book was that there isn't a book that talks about Indian experiences of polyamory. There are many wonderful, thoughtful, evocative, provocative books on polyamory written in the US, written in the UK, the ethical slut that everybody begins their life or journey of love reading has been there since the 1970s, and there are tons of great books. But even while these experiences of people leading polyamorous lives are courageous and thoughtful, they do not represent the context where we find ourselves in India. And I'll give you just 3 things that are very specific to why this is tough in India. Freedom of choice and being independent is a completely different ballgame in India. We never leave our families, actually, no matter how independently we are living. We have large families, complex relationships. People have rights over each other's lives, much more than many other countries, especially in the West. So our lives are never completely independent, nor are the choices that we make, because every choice that we make, we are so aware how many people they're going to affect adversely as well. So the community, the caste, the religion, the family, where all of these complex threads become this unresolvable knot, is part of our everyday life. And that makes any kind of decision like this very hard. Secondly, the domestic space is never quite private in Indian families. In our domestic spaces, there are parents, uncles, aunts, siblings. It's a mix. We can't, our sense of privacy, what is private and what is public, is the line between that is so open and porous, you know. So I can't say that this part of my life is completely private and nobody will have any say or any right to it. No, you can't say that. So that is the second reason why I can't just decide to live a certain way in my domestic space without it impacting other people again.
And even in like when you go for a family function or something, people will ask you the most private, personal questions.
Yes.
With,
and it is
great
as specific as 3 साल शादी के हो गए, बच्चे क्यों नहीं हुए? Like they want the laundry list of reasons that you might be able to give. And the third thing why it's really hard in India is because here nothing is about sex and everything is about sex. So the moment you talk about any kind of love, the first thing that people want to know is there sex involved in it or not? That's why in the definition I said, let me just make it very specific, with or without sexual intimacy.
Required. And you said you wrote the book because so that others could feel less lost and lonely.
Yeah. Because, you know, when I started meeting a larger group of polyamorous people, and there are groups in Bangalore, and these are incredibly supportive. Each member there is incredibly supportive of each other. Not everybody is out. So we have to be even more considerate about the way we can help each other as well. I realized that while talking to them, that like me, growing up as a person who didn't quite fit in, because we didn't have the word polyamorous then, didn't quite fit into the, or bought in, I would say, to the one true love myth that is sold constantly to us by all kinds of popular culture, state, family, everything. They grow up feeling very lost and freakish and with all kinds of ideas about the self, you know, that is not very nice. So I felt maybe writing the book, whoever picks it up wherever, like I wish when I was growing up in Asansol, I had a book like this and I could pick up and say, okay, there are these people also, and it's not so bad.
And as you were telling me earlier, it's almost like it was with the queer community 3 decades, 20 years ago,
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah.
You know, and like most people haven't come out yet. Talk a bit about that.
Also because, so I also realized while writing, so I was writing publicly about polyamory for a while now, about almost 8 years. And Priya, actually, you were one of the first people I had this conversation with, sitting right here a few years ago, sitting right on this stage when Ravi had invited us for this panel, What Women Want, during Women's Day. And we spoke, and I realized that I have so many privileges that allows me to write about it or openly say I am polyamorous. I don't have family other than my mother, and she understands. So therefore, I don't have to worry about that large family circuit.
लोग क्या कहेंगे?
लोग क्या कहेंगे? हमारे वैसे लोग है ही नहीं. और the second thing is that I choose to live singly, and therefore I chose not to have children. So therefore, I don't have a spouse, I don't have kids. But there are polyamorous people who are married, who have children, who have many other tie-ins with society, which makes them very vulnerable to abuse if the word gets out. And I feel they are like 10 times more brave than me to like sort of still follow a path that will only get them moral judgments from everyone. I mean, it's as simple as, you know, one of the maybe group members will by mistake acknowledge something in public in a school meet of the kids or something as simple as that. I was reading about Boys Don't Cry, a film that had come out many, many years ago. Hilary Swank won the award for that, about Brandon Teena. And I was thinking, maybe polyamorous people feel like that today when they're not out. As how bad could that abuse get if things got out?
There are a lot of monoamorous people in the audience, I'm sure. Tell them what are some of the rules that you break on a daily basis? Some of their rules.
Yeah, so I think monoamorous people themselves break the rules. So I'm okay saying what polyamorous people break the rules. But one thing I do want to mention here, Priya, that there's no, and I make it really clear in the book that I'm hugely respectful of anybody who can love. Doesn't matter who they love, how many they love, how they love, how long they love for. But the fact that they can put someone else outside of themselves before them, because that's what love is all about, right? That in itself, truly, to have done it even once in life is a huge achievement, I feel, to be able to do that. So I have great respect for everyone who has loved, ever. And there is no competition between monoamory or polyamory either, because because this also, I've seen a lot of this, that this kind of love is better. I mean, that's exactly what polyamorists are fighting, that monoamory is not the only moral, ethical way to love. And we want all these different ways of loving to exist next to each other. What I'm more interested in sharing in the book as well is that our hardships are quite similar. So can we learn from each other? Now, some of the rules that you break, because that's how that practice is. The first rule is, the moment you take away exclusivity of love, which is what monoamory's first rule is, exclusive, right? You have to redefine trust, loyalty, fidelity, and what each of these things mean. So I always wondered why in monoamory you define these things by saying what you will not do with another person. So you will not have a deep emotional connect with another person. You will not have sex with another person. You will not travel with another person. It is so seldom to do with what you will actually do with the person that you're in love with. So I think that's the first rule, that in polyamory, you have to define what trust means between the two people, not how it is outside in the negative space of those two people. The second thing is that the moment you take away exclusivity, you also take away what I feel is a very unhappy rule of monoamory, which is, I call it couple on top, because it's the centrality of the couplehood that sort of takes over your life. That's why so many friends are worried when one of them gets married, that, oh, acha, abhi to I won't get to see them anymore, because then that couplehood becomes the central thing of everything. All your important dates, everything is around that twosome. And it's on a hierarchy more than any other relationships of friendships, of your love for parents, of siblings, relationship with siblings. And if any of those other relationships ever comes in even close proximity to this one, there are questions raised about both your orientation, your tendencies, whether it's a kind of, unnatural thing, etc., etc. So I think this is also broken in polyamory, because the moment you throw in more than two people in the mix, you are now negotiating with multiple individuals and your relationships with all of them. So you cannot have couple on top. So these are two rules, that exclusivity and centrality, that get broken on an everyday basis.
I'd like to read out some of the questions people ask Arundhati, and I would request you all not to ask these same questions at the end of the session. How do you make time for multiple partners? How's the sex? Isn't it a fad? Which is harder, monoamory or polyamory? I can't even find one love. How do you find so many?
All the time, yeah. You want me to respond to any of them now?
You decide. Yeah, why not? Respond.
I'll answer the last one then. Because that's, I get asked a lot. So my answer in the same playfulness as this question was first asked, that I can't find even one love, how do you find many? My answer is, if you stop looking for one, you will probably find many. Because the just imagine looking for that one true love, okay? Because I've done it, I know. There's a long list of needs, desires, guarantees against all our fears, the weight of the promises many other people haven't been able to commit to us. And that list becomes longer and harder. And not just that we have that list. Everybody in that situation who's looking at us also has that list. And then we don't make it to anybody's list. Or half-heartedly, and we call it a compromise, half-heartedly we make it to some parts of the list. But there's always this thing ki ye pura to na hua. So, but imagine now, you don't have this list. All you're responding to is the person opposite you. And there's something in the person that sparks something in you. And there's a connection. And you try and build something around that, around something that is already there. And imagine meeting many people like that. You will, because if you're no longer thinking of a list that has to be fulfilled. So that's why while I say it playfully, I actually believe that we stop looking for that one that we have to find. Maybe we'll find more.
Yeah, I think even psychologist Esther Perel refers to this, that we, in our partner, in our monoamorous partner, we're looking for the perfect friend, the perfect lover, the perfect,
parents, parents sometimes. Yeah. And all those gaps that have been, it's so unfortunate actually. All the gaps that, all our lives have gaps. All the gaps that have been left by all the people who could not or did not fulfill what they had to. So there are these like little potholes in our lives. And now this one person has to somehow fill all of those, gaps. It's hard. Forget somebody else doing it for you. Imagine you being judged like that.
So I guess in a way it's, pardon my ignorance, but in a way, is it like having a friend, like an art friend and a movie friend? Like I have friends I go to art, like I go to Kochi every second year with, and the two of us, like we meet once in 2 years and we spend from morning to night with each other and see every single artwork. Do you do different things with different partners?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, it depends, so unlike monoamory, where mostly the rules remain the same, polyamory does have this very wide canvas where we could decide what the boundaries or the conditions or even the scope and canvas of this relationship is going to be like. It's determined by the two or more people involved. And therefore, a lot of polyamorous also don't make a distinction between this is love, this is friendship, this is sex, this is romance. And we probably allow a little blurring of these boundaries, not to fix anything, because also we believe, many of us believe, that these relationships can morph and change, and not to, I heard this thing recently also because I'm very old, friend zoning people, like when you friend zone somebody. And I was like, such a violent word. It's actually almost making you seem like you take the person, put them in a room and never let them leave that ever. So this zoning business, okay, let's say polyamorous have much more liberal and open zoning rules. Many of us, again, somebody might say that no, my polyamory is different from yours, and that's okay too.
So your focus is on building deep connections.
Yes, as many as possible, with happiness, trust, and care for each other, but also with honesty, as much as possible.
2 questions you do tackle at length in the book, and also we are asking these questions now, so we won't go back to them later. Is polyamory a choice, a lifestyle, or an identity?
Yeah.
You start with that first, then I'll ask the second.
Choice, lifestyle, identity. It could be all three, depending on who you're asking. It's something, some people have always felt, and I'll tell you why I'm saying this. Some people have always felt that they have it in them to love more than one person. They feel that they have the desire, the ability, and are able to practice it. But they choose not to. They might say, hey, I don't want to because I choose to live my life with this one person. And this is what I choose to do. It's like being vegetarian by choice or being non-vegetarian by choice. So that could be by choice, that you have chosen monoamory. You could also choose to be polyamorist when you realize that you have the desire and the ability. Many of us also see this as an identity because of something you said at the very beginning, that love is political. It's not just something that we do, but it defines who we are. So for me, I've seen, the more I thought about it, my angst against one or the singular is a very political angst, especially when I look around today and I see this whole campaign for one nation, one language, one religion, one leader. It irks me. And I think somewhere my faith in a belief in a polyphonic, multiplicity wala universe, I refuse to say that that's only going to be on the outside, on the streets, when I'm fighting for causes. And it will not enter my home. And even if it enters my home, it's not going to be restricted to my drawing room or my kitchen. And I'm going to keep my bedroom out of it. So this polyphonicness has to enter everywhere, including the most intimate spaces that I have. So for me, it's also an identity. For someone else, it might just be a lifestyle. It's something that they enjoy doing. That's how they like living. So
you talk very honestly in the book about jealousy and how your journey through it and conquering it and all the ups and downs of it. Tell us a bit about that.
Oh gosh, yeah. So I'm an extremely proud and egoistical person, I think, and that's why I used to be super jealous till I realized that jealousy had very little to do with my partners or what they did or friends. It had so much to do with my own feelings of insecurity and fear, my fear of feeling abandoned or replaced, or not, my need for being needed, not being taken care of, you know. So and then as I went deeper into jealousy and in trying to understand, I realized it comes from, it's an emotion that has sources in many things. Of course, insecurity, fear, but also in competition. You know, from the time we are kids, we are pushed into a very almost invisible kind of competitive routine. So our parents only smile more when we get a prize home. So we start thinking of our self-worth connected to what we can achieve. And therefore, the other side of it, which is that when we win, it's self-worth, and when we lose, it's also a reflection to the self. We also start seeing love like that, or people like that. So we start saying, I have lost somebody to someone. Or you win your love from someone. All our popular culture, if you see the films, books, stories, myths that we read, everybody is winning and losing love as if it is a competition. This is the language we use as well. So I feel that also has a lot to do with jealousy, this feeling of a lack of self-worth, and what comes out is jealousy. I have seen among, so in the polyamory language, my partner's other partner is called a metamor. But I like using the word co-lovers. I just like it because it has the word love in it. It's somehow more emotional. So among my co-lovers, I feel more jealous when I feel insecure about something. So for example, I don't ride a bike, I don't play sports, and I'm not an academic. Let's just say these three. So my jealousy or insecurity is higher to do with those partners of my partners where I know these are the things that they enjoy doing, And that's what I have to try and deal with. And the dealing part is that the first thing is that you realize that you are responsible for that feeling, not anyone else. It's something inside you. And then you start working like any other self work. It takes time, it takes energy, it takes a little talking across. If your partners are happy to do it, then you discuss it with them that this is how you're feeling. And you go through the feeling. The point is not to think of it as something that is unnatural or unwise, and just deal with it. And I hope one day I can arrive at that point where compulsion, where you actually feel happy that I'm getting there. I think I'm getting there. Let's see. Yeah.
One of the very powerful parts of your book for me was all the deep dives into the relationships in the book where you interview people, especially the story of Siddharth and Mandeep's relationships, because they're different parts of their journey and feel differently about the things, and how they navigate the journey of polyamory together. How did you get people to share so openly, and how did you select stories? And
I think a lot of it goes to the generosity of spirit with which they shared. I think when I shared with them the idea of why I was writing the book, and how I wanted the book to be something that could help people explore, even people who are monoamorous today, to explore their own lives and see. I think a lot of them opened up and said that they would like to share. Also, with many of the people, I have shared a much longer relationship of friendship and trust. So, Mandeep and Siddharth, for example, Mandeep Rekhi, I've known for a very long time as a dancer, as a choreographer. I absolutely love his work. And we've been talking about his work, art, sedition, love, many things. And we came to it, and when I was writing the book, I asked him, and he said, okay, I'll talk to my partner and see. And then I spoke to Siddharth, and both of them were okay. But I think what was beautiful is how much they trusted me. I feel really overwhelmed how much these people who gave these interviews trusted that, just trusted, you know.
And is that why you chose to represent them in their own voices in the form of a Q&A rather than taking things from them?
Yeah, because I wanted this book to be not just me. It's not just me. It's stories of many people. And as much as possible, though, yes, I am the author of it, but in some places, I have retained that author's voice in all the chapters and the insights. But the interviews, I wanted them to be almost like in between the chapters, like live. So you feel when you're reading it that you've walked into their lives and they are opening up their hearts to show you their experience, to take you with them onto a journey. Because all of them are in different places with their journeys with love and life. And I could not speak for them. So.
And while you do act as an amazing guide through all these journeys and this idea of polyamory, there's a lot about your own selves that you don't share.
Yeah. So there are stories that are not just mine. So that's the other thing with polyamory, right? You're holding multiple confidences, and you have to be respectful to those. So even before I thought of writing the book, I had to talk to the people in my life, the first people I talked to, that would they be okay with me writing the book and how much of me I could share. In fact, I think I have shared too much. I needn't have shared so much.
Yeah, I mean, of course you.
Too much in the sense at some point I did feel, is it becoming like, too much of self and not enough of the insights that one gets from
no, I don't
other
think
lives.
so. I think it was a beautiful mix. And I am waiting to see, to watch you get letters from readers saying you broke up my relationship. I told my husband that I was polyamorous and he said, oh, what is this?
No, but with polyamory,
this has happened to you before,
yes,
right?
It has. But, they didn't break up. So that's the beauty of polyamory, which I try explaining, but I don't know how much I get through. Is this, that with polyamory, you don't have to stop loving somebody just because you've fallen in love with someone
You don't
else.
have to, but they might not want to love you back.
Well, if somebody does love you, then why would they not want to love you back just because you love someone else? I mean, it's worth getting into a conversation on this, I feel. Like, not to take it as given, but just say, okay, so I love you as I have always loved you. Now I love Priya. Why do you think that makes our love any different? Is a conversation worth getting into. That's all I'm saying.
And you use the example of a parent and how a parent loves so many children.
Anybody asked mothers, which child, how you're having two, how can you love both? How much time you will give this one and how much time you'll give that one? And then also among siblings, you have multiple siblings, and we love all of them quite naturally because we are born into this. But somehow this whole monoamory and monogamy has captured our brains and hearts so much that we seem to only have questions to justify it, rather than saying, "Hey, this is how I feel, but can I at least ask questions as to why I feel like this?"
Tell us some more about the making of the book, the behind the scenes angst, how you wrote, what you worried about,
Worried about, I felt the weight of people's confidences. Weight also because I didn't know that in the insights that I was talking about, especially there's a chapter called Red Flags, where a lot of people shared their bad experiences and abusive experiences that they've had. And when I tried to mix up the stories and not give out too many details so people wouldn't figure, but I still worried about whether there were things in it that might impact people, and if it might destroy relationships which are there, which also has happened with some of the interviews. So when I didn't always interview people together, I've sometimes interviewed them separately, and then they've read each other's answers, and some of those have been very difficult conversations, because what happens when somebody else asks you and you say something, you don't often have had that exact discussion. So there's so much.
And people may tell you things that they don't tell their partner. You have that vibe.
I don't know whether I have that vibe, Priya. But I think it happens when a third person asks you, you say it very casually. And then suddenly everything becomes about that one word that you've used. And it gets stuck there. And that needle refuses to move from that point. So I was very aware of all this. Also, I have deleted a lot of stuff that was there in the first draft, because I felt that people's lives were more important than any book that will ever get written. And those lives matter. And if I even had a little inkling that something that I was writing would adversely affect somebody's life, what I don't know, I don't know. Suppose I don't see it, then it's okay. There's nothing I can do about it. But if I'm seeing it, then I can't have it just because it adds a little more flourish to that chapter.
We follow that principle at India Love Project too. When someone suddenly writes to us after months saying, look, I shared my story then, but, this has happened. And, can you please? Yeah. We don't ask any questions. We say, sure.
Because it's people's confidences. So I want to say this here because you talked about the India Love Project. I thought I'll say it at the end, but I will. All of us, whether we are as people, as movements, as causes we fight for, we always stand on the shoulders of giants that have been here before us. In the feminist movement, we know that we are here because there were generations before us. In the queer world also, we have elders. Because of them, we have what we have today. I think this book, specifically, I feel, stands on the shoulders of two giants, the India Love Project that you and Samar started, and Agents of Ishq that Paromita Vora started, because in very unapologetically, it placed love as an important political, I don't want to say tool, but an important political process, let's say. It gave love in India that jagah. To tell these stories is important. So thank you and Samar and Paro
for this. And thank you for your brilliant book. So you all were introduced earlier, but maybe you can say a line about yourself because I don't think the mic was clear in the beginning.
Hey everyone, I'm Anu. I'm a solo polyamorous relationship anarchist. If you need any details about these two words, please let me know. I'll
No,
tell you.
We'll definitely talk about them. And Basit?
I'm Basit Manham. I've been poly for some time and as part of the Bangalore Polycules group, support group for polyamorous people in Bangalore. We do yearly public event called the Aneka Priyate. And otherwise, we are a support group for other polyamorous people. Thank you for it.
So I'll ask all of you all, I mean, both of you all especially, when did you all realize you all were polyamorous? Arundhati says she realized in school when she found she was capable of falling in love with more than one person. And I think many of us may have had that experience, but how do you go from that, knowing that then to on a journey of polyamory, you know? And how did you break that bastion of that one true love?
For me, I had a very religious upbringing when I was growing up. So for till I was 20 or so, when I turned atheist, I hadn't considered any relationships because of religious reasons. And when I was 20, there was a bunch of people in my college I felt attracted to, and I had a crush on, and I wanted to see how things will go with them. And during this time, I got into a relationship, and it was my first relationship. It was her first relationship. It was a very exciting time. But regardless of that, like throughout, I was also feeling like my crushes for these other people had not gone away just because even though I'm in a relationship at the moment. So when that feeling continued existing in me, I started initially thinking that maybe, okay, this is open relationships is what I wanted to do. And I got really lucky in while Googling more about open relationships and finding that there are so many different ways of doing open relationships. And I was going through one by one of each terms, and I came across polyamory. This was in around 2013 when I was 20, 21. And I feel like I'm really lucky with having found that word and term early on because it helped me. I didn't have to do a lot of figuring my own by myself. I constantly looked for other people's stories and resources online to learn more about polyamory. So yeah, I would say that was my beginning of.
For me, in retrospect, it makes sense that I used to think polyamorous even before, but for the longest time, I never got into a relationship with anyone because I had crush on so many people. So I just loved them and be like, mind your own business. I'll just sit here and love you. That kind of an attitude. So, but it's much later when I moved to Bangalore. I went on a date with someone and I was telling this person that I'm seeing other people as well. And she asked me, so are you polyamorous? And that was the first time I was hearing the word Googled, and whatever I read made total sense. And she said there's a new group that started in Bangalore, a support group for polyamorous people. You should meet those folks and talk to them. That's how I got into the Bangalore Polycules.
And you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm quite ancient. So, school, college was where I figured. But I was full of guilt that time. And the only way I knew how to deal with that was either you ended one relationship and began another, or you cheated. I mean, those were the only two ways in which you could justify falling for more than one person. The moment you fell in love with another person or even wanted to explore a relationship with another person, you had to end the one that you were having. So I discovered, I think I accepted fully, etc., and called it out for myself and the world only about 15 years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, not before that.
So all of you all essentially came out in the Modi era.
Look, and we constantly blame him, right? He has some good parts. Yeah, certainly.
So one question that I'm sure all of you all get, you have more than one lover and you still can't find someone to live with. That's a question that everyone who practices what is known as solo polyamory has answered at some point. After Arundhati explains what that means, I'd like to ask if there's any differences in the way you all practice solo polyamory.
Well,
But first you explain the
okay.
the
So
idea.
again, it may be slightly different for us. So for me, it is that I just choose to live solo and take all decisions in my life, whether they're important ones, financial, medical, social ones, political ones, solo. And I want my domestic space for myself. I don't want to share that with anyone. Not for long periods of time. I think I have about a month that I can spend with other people, but then I want it back to myself. And so that's what it means to me. And I do that because I just find it actually, it's what I find most practical and simpler for me to lead a polyamorous life. I think it's way more complicated for people who have domestic partners, too many negotiations, etc. Yeah, so.
Anu, you?
I do live with someone, just not my partner. I have a flatmate, and we have this great chemistry. Like, we complement each other very well. That's my living arrangement, and we're very happy there. But I don't know if I would ever want to live with a partner. I might. It's not written in stone, but with solo polyamory, I have I have a relationship with. It's a separate relationship with each person that I'm in a relationship with, a romantic relationship with, or a sexual relationship with. I spend time with those people, and like either at their place or my place, and then we go back to our places. We like our personal space a lot.
And you, Basit?
I'm wondering if many of you would be thinking, even though all of us are solo poly here, there are so many different ways of doing that itself. And I think that's a big important thing as well. The idea is not polyamory or solo polyamory or anything. The idea is that you should try to customize relationships in a way that works for you. That's what any poly person or any of us are trying to say, I believe. And so, yeah, what makes me solo is that again, like the others have shared, that I do not feel like living with a partner continuously. I love spending time with them at their place or them having over to mine. But living together, running a household together is a different thing from like spending and staying over at someone's place, right? So that there I feel like I'd like to decide those things by myself, having not to consider too much of other people. Of course, like when your partner is sick, sometimes you have to consider or make adjustments in your life around that. But other than that, things regarding finances or how much, like what my spending habits are going to be, how much am I going to donate, or like what are my, like all these things, I would like to not have to constantly like compromise or like make a decision together with another person around these things, which is what makes me solo polyamorous, I believe.
So one question I have is, there right now in my life, there's a lot of caregiving, for my husband's mother or for him for my parents, Do you guys have to do that too? Arundhati,
Yeah.
maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Of course. I mean, so there's one thing that the world often single shames you, whether you're a solo polyamorous or
Yeah.
a single person. You're single shamed into belief. The world tells you that single people are very selfish people. And yet, you will see it is the single people who look after parents. It is the single people who get called when they're
That's true.
married with kids, people need babysitters. It's the single people who are in hospitals. It's the single people who are everywhere looking after, taking care. But you're just, so I'm speaking from that point of view as a solo polyamorist. Of course, you look after those that need care, not just of yourself, your mother, your father, but also your partners. But here, with polyamorous people, there is another thing. In a monogamous world, you're very much hum do, hamare do kinds. Now that it is understood that you will look after yours. And this yours is very definite. It's you, your husband, two parents. For poly people, this world is quite large, right?
That's true.
Also, if you're not making distinctions between lovers and friends and romance and sex and all of that, you're just available for caregiving for those that need who you love.
At an equally intense level. I mean,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, because it's required. It's more like a practical thing that's needed at that time, and you're going to be there, you're going to show up. So going back to that question you had earlier about how we define trust or loyalty with each other, it's about this. It's not about whether I'm sleeping with somebody else or not. It actually doesn't matter to you if I am. What matters is, am I going to pick up that call at 2 a.m. in the morning and come to the hospital? I will.
It's about showing up for your community and not just your nuclear pod.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah. It's like it just feels to me that's a very natural part of any relationship, and which would exist in solo poly as well. Just that solo poly people don't want to make decisions with other people. That's all.
So, how do young people fight the fight today? You say, Arundhati, in your book, you say that most gender fluid and polyamorous youngsters have no expectations from their parents, and they often say that their parents don't understand them. I have the same experience with interfaith, intercaste, and queer couples that I meet through India Love Project. Parents are the biggest obstacle to love today, almost more than the state, I feel. And does this come up a lot in Bangalore polycules?
Thanks for the question. It's a very difficult and tough question as well. It's true. Like you mentioned with the India Love Project, I think there's a lot of similarities with how polyamorous people as well feel. I think there is like many levels of acceptance and types of disagreements that parents have also. Like if you're talking about like things like okay, don't marry outside of your caste because of bloodline and all, I don't have anything to say there. Like just waiting for people like that to pass on. But the majority of the time, that's not what the concern of the parents are. They are often like worried about their children, and that's completely understandable. But one level before that is that natar and the parim, log kya kahange, and yeah, that's a very sad reality of our Indian culture that constantly we have to try to navigate that and as much as possible live around that. But a lot of the times it's simply because the parents are worried about their children, and Indian parents, and generally both way. I think it works both ways.
But everything is masked under this garb of worry.
Yeah, yeah. I guess, yeah, that's
it's
true.
Like
yeah,
for your good, we worry about you,
right.
please.
And I'm hoping at least some of them are telling it honestly and not trying to and not trying to cover their other beliefs with the cloak of worry. Yeah, yeah, there is resignation from the side of the children, and sometimes trying to thinking it's really pointless in trying to talk to them. But at the same time, I believe there's a lot of merit in also trying to be patiently trying to explain to them, show your lives, and slowly let them understand you better. It's a long process. It won't happen in a few years. For like most people, it won't happen. And with limited success, we hear some stories in the Bangalore Polycules groups also where people slowly introduce to their parents. And over years, they come around and change their minds and are more accepting in their children's lives and accepting of their other partners as well. So there is hope in there. And but at the same time, I completely understand and see the pain of people who don't want to spend the effort in trying to explain to their parents because of like previous bad examples they had, and just like feeling like a lot of waste of energy in trying to get their acceptance around that. Another very unfortunate part of the Indian culture is also that parents, like for somehow, it is sad that it's part of their success in life and goals that if their children are not married or like settled in the way that they think, they feel themselves as to be a failure in their life, which is sad. Like a huge generation, like a big generation have been like conditioned that way.
That's such an important point.
Another issue that which most people have is that like you find something that works for you and you're happy about it. And you assume that other people also will be happy only if with that. Yeah, but the reality is not that. Like people have very differences in interests and how they look at things. And so, yeah, I guess because of that, like a lot of parents think that, okay, like, and even sadder part is that maybe sometimes it's not even that they have found happiness in that, but they've been told that happiness lies there and they try to like, like want their children also to have it.
So you do give some advice to parents, even though you give it in a very gentle way and say, I'm not a parent, so I don't know this, but you might consider that Tell us some of the advice that you...
Yes. So, sometimes I feel like the family is like a mini state. And then the parents become the state. Actually, they are representatives of the state. They can become like that if they believe that control, like the state wants you to be obedient citizens, right? You have to listen to the state and follow all the rules, regulations, etc. Similarly, in the family also, it's like a mini state. And even if the state is, so some families are more open than others, more liberal than others, but within that functions of the state. And parents do say, now a lot of young people that I met said that they were really disappointed with their parents' lives because they saw so much of denial and silence in their parents' lives. So it's not that they are being insensitive to their parents' lives. They are actually seeing it and seeing the deception, the denial, the silence that the parents are having to deal with, and they're questioning why. My advice only was to the extent that listen to what they are saying, and do not think this worry that Basit you talked about. This worry is often the garb that one uses for things that one doesn't know or one is fearful of themselves. And we say it's a worry, but it's actually not worry for the kids. It's worry for themselves that they are unable to fathom this. Yeah.
I don't know if people have noticed this, but liberal parents don't have an issue with queerness or polyamory, any kind of non-normativity, as long as it's not their kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why do so many people still not take polyamory seriously? Arundhati, you offer some thoughts in your book. You say, you ask whether, is it because it crumbles the idea of family as we know it? Or is it because collective living ruptures existing economic models? Or is it because of our constant worries about abandonment and feeling unloved? And
yeah, I think all of this, I feel that fear of loneliness, fear of not knowing, I would rather like live with the known devil, like though monogamy, monogamous families, monoamory has produced so much of isolation, depression, loneliness within it. It's completely fractured. If you look at the institution of marriage today, they're really like painting up a mansion that's falling apart, and the center is not holding anymore. So, and yet we thoda marammat idhar udhar karke we try and use that instead of stepping away and saying, are there other ways? Also because I think we are very afraid to try new things because it might fail. Not that what we have is not failing, but yeah, I think fear, to me, fear is the biggest problem in stepping out, stepping away.
In my family, a lot of the questions boil down to what would you do when you are sick, when you're unwell, when you're old. These are the questions that they always ask to try and get me married.
To one person?
Yes. Because if there is a legal binding, it holds better than a word that you had with each other. So that happens quite a lot in my family, at least.
Not that there aren't enough stories amongst us, even I'm sure in this room, of abandonment, of, I mean, within monoamory. It's monoamory or monogamy has never been a solution either for loneliness or for any of these ills that we talk of, right? People may die early, people may leave, people may cheat, but all that is okay because that is the done way of things. That's the...
And also the Indian family as we know it today is often the center of so much violence. If you ask the queer community.
Of course, domestic violence of all kinds, not just partner violence, but also parents. I mean, parents, sometimes domestic violence is the domestic space is much more violent space than the outside. So, but the family has to be protected at all cost. I also feel that the family is somehow religion, state coming and business. So religion, state and capitalism with patriarchy coming together to form this box where you must now put everybody in. So now they can't revolt against any of these. I feel that's also a problem.
I'd like to thank Arundhati, Basit and Nanu on everyone's behalf for expanding our horizons and showing us that there are many ways to love and not just the one that many of us have been brought up with. I hope we'll all go out sharing some of our new ideas and judgment-free thoughts with other people.
Thank you, and thank the audience as well.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you liked what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website or leave us a review on Apple Podcast or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is S. Sarvana Raj and Ranjit Kumar on sound supervision and production. Artwork is designed by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Sunaina Jain signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.